Thank you to Brian, and we're going to ask Simon Black to come up and talk about his chapter on community unionism.
Thanks. My chapter arose out of my PhD work, my dissertation work. Originally, I was going to study community unionism in New York City, and I went there on a research trip, and I was working under a professor there, Francis Fox-Piven, and he's been a great mentor. And I presented this idea. I had a supervisor at York University where I studied political science. I said, I want to look at how community unions or community-based workers' organizations have organized around welfare reform. And she says, well, they haven't really. And I said, well, there's all these different examples, and surely they've been affected somehow. And she said, no, they haven't been affected. So, it's a total defeat in terms of what happened to welfare in New York City. So I changed my dissertation project. I guess how impressionable a graduate student can be. And I started looking at the interrelation of childcare and welfare policy in Toronto and New York City. So that's what I did. But the opportunity to write this chapter that Larry and Stephanie asked me to do was returning to that original work and trying to think through what are some of the limitations of community unionism. Now, one of the things when I started doing the research for the original dissertation was looking at the literature in community unionism. There's two really distinct literatures. There's one about community labor coalitions, and that's called community unionism, and then there's one about worker centers, and that's also called community unionism. So when I sat down to write this chapter, I thought to myself, if I was a graduate student or an undergrad, what kind of, what would I like to read? What would be a synopsis? What could synthesize these two literatures? So that's what I set out to write, a synthesis of those two different approaches to community unionism. I think I achieved that. I'm not really one for false modesty, but I do write the chapter. I start by talking about community, because I think community is something that's bandied about, the concept is bandied about on the left a lot. Everybody talks about community. And we talk, not only the left, right? We talk about a business community as well. Right? So I define community, and I look at the different ways in the literature on community unionism that community has been defined. And so it's really kind of three different ways communities have been defined, and that's as a common identity, common interest, or common kind of geographic space we inhabit, like the city or a neighborhood within the city. And a lot of community unions take these three notions of community and really embody them in their work. So there's a workers-based organization in Manhattan that I was looking at called the Chinese Staff Workers Association that organizes Chinese immigrants, so one common identity, in Chinatown, the geography, to increase their wages and better their working conditions in sweatshops in Chinatown on the Lower East Side. So that's the common interest. I go on to talk about how this notion of community has also been romanticized by the left historically. If we think about someone like, familiar with Raymond Williams, talking about working class, the pit towns of northern England, or in Canadian context, someone like Cape Breton. How there seems to be, or there is at least some tendency on the left to kind of romanticize those sorts of working class communities. And I talk about how community as a political and a social construct has often been used to not only find solidarities, but very much to suppress differences within a community like Cape Breton. So what is the working class interest in a coal town like Cape Breton? If you're if you're a mother who stays at home and has to labor under the patriarchal conditions of the household that are set by your coal mining husband, or what it would be when you think of communities, what is it like for LGBT folks in a place like a working class community like the pit towns of northern England? what is their common interest when kind of heteronormativity is like the hegemonic sexuality in the community like that. So I try to problematize community, and then I get into these two different strains of community. The worker centers, which people are familiar with, like the Workers' Action Center here in Toronto. There's worker centers kind of springing up in all sorts of places in Canada now, like Hamilton, in Winnipeg, Windsor, and then I talk about the labor community coalitions. I give an example of the Ontario Health Coalition. And I try to pull out, from looking at these examples, what works in terms of community unionism. And I don't think I was able to do that. I think I was able to pull out what doesn't work. I mean, so maybe that's like a negative image, right? So you see what works by finding out what doesn't work. And what doesn't work when it comes to community labor coalitions, so when we talk about unions working with community groups, is when unions go to community groups and treat them as a junior partner in a coalition. So I don't think this has been the case in the Ontario Health Coalition, but there's definitely coalitions across Canada where unions go into the community and ask for the community support to achieve kind of narrowly defined labor ends. And there's not really reciprocity in terms of the goals, maybe shared perspectives of the two actors, of the community organization and of the labor union. In terms of worker centers, like I said, have sprung up all across Canada and been very popular in the United States. All major cities in the United States now have something like a community-based workers organization. So some organization in the community that works around issues of work and labor. And I look at what works there and what doesn't work there. And I think that a lot of the popular education models and kind of participatory models of organizing that the labor movement in its business unionism sort of style and model of organizing has abandoned is what works in terms of these community unions and community organizing more broadly. So that's what the chapter attempts to do, and then I talk a little bit about what is the potential for these two different models of community unionism in terms of struggling, beating back neoliberalism. And your guess is as good as mine. I mean, I think there's a lot of potential for these types of community organizations, like the Workers' Action Center does great work, but there's limits because community-based workers organizations, worker centers, don't really have economic power like a union does. They don't have the ability to withdraw, withdraw their labor in a collective, organized fashion, and often legally. What they are reliant upon is lobbying for public policy changes, like the Workers' Action Center did around temporary work agencies and successful regulation that was passed by the McGuinty government after years of lobbying and organizing. And they also have the power to disrupt. And I think that power to disrupt also shows that community unions, worker centers, and these coalitions between community and labor really are drawing upon past practices of the labor movement before it was kind of formalized under the post-war social contract. That they draw on things like organizations like the IWW and maybe some past craft union practices as well to really try to mobilize the power of some of the most excluded and marginalized workers in today's economy. So that's what the chapter does, and hope you check it
out. Thank you, Simon. I'll just give a couple comments on the chapter that I wrote in the book, which was a chapter that looked at strategic voting as an electoral tactic that's sort of gained some steam in the labor movement. And I make two arguments in the chapter. The first is that as an instrumental strategy, strategic voting has been a failure in Ontario provincial elections and in federal elections recently. And the second argument I make is that on an ideological level, that strategic voting has helped shift the political terrain to the right, which over the long term will actually serve to hurt the labor movement's political interests in a more deeper and sustained kind of way. So on the instrumental argument, I look specifically at the 1999 Ontario provincial election, where many unions decided to abandon a relationship with the NDP after the Ray years and sort of call on their members to vote strategically for Liberal candidates in ridings where New Democrats didn't have a hope in hell of winning. And then I also look at the federal level starting in 2006, where more and more unions at the federal level decided that they would try to implement the same strategy in order to first prevent the election of the Harper Conservatives, and then in those subsequent elections to stop the re-election of the Harper Conservatives. In all of those elections, of course, the Tories won. And it has caused much internal debate in the labor movement about what the relationship should look like between unions and political parties, if those relationships should exist at all, or whether this makes sense as a common sense entry into the parliamentary political arena. I won't spare you the details other than to state the obvious, which you all know, which are in those campaigns that Conservatives won. But if we even think back to the last 2011 federal election, where after a series of elections where this strategy didn't work out, several unions continued to use it. But what was most interesting was in the 2011 federal election. This is the election, of course, where the NDP unexpectedly rises to official opposition status. There were still unions towards the end of the campaign that were calling on their members to vote strategically for Liberal candidates in ridings where the NDP couldn't win. And in particular, SEIU Local 2 and the Canadian Auto Workers had a list of 50 slim win ridings where they thought the strategic voting could help prevent the election of the Conservatives. But in 7 of those ridings, the identified strategic voting candidate actually finished in 3rd place, thus undermining the entire logic of the campaign in those ridings, and in some cases arguably facilitating the election of Conservative candidates. That's on the sort of, there's lots of numbers game in the chapter that demonstrates some of the strategies and the electoral outcomes. But on an ideological level, which is the other argument, there are important implications, I argue, because I think strategic voting has an educative effect on rank-and-file union members when the leadership rubber stamps these strategies. And so in Ontario, if we can think of unions who have adopted this strategy vis-a-vis the Liberal government, a government that, remember, before the election, has come out very strongly to say, we will not support an anti-SCAT legislation in Ontario. We will not extend collective bargaining rights to agricultural workers. We will not support card-based union certification outside of the building trades. And yet, we still see a coalition of unions time after time that will enter into these electoral pacts with the Liberal Party, even though what I would argue is some pretty basic fundamental labor issues have already been cast aside. And this does have an important, especially over time, an ideological wearing down on the union about what is possible in the electoral arena. So if there are lessons to be learned from the chapter, I think what's most evident in this last round of elections and strategic voting is that unions are trying to shield themselves from the worst excesses of neoliberal public policy. And they've made a calculation that trying to prevent the election of Conservatives is more important than facilitating the election of New Democrats or other progressive candidates. I should be clear, though, that the chapter is not a call for the labor movement to redouble its efforts to build and strengthen its relationship to the NDP. I think that Brian's chapter shows, and many of us involved in the book know, that there are very severe limitations to that strategy. So rather, I think it's a call to look beyond the ballot box, to rethink about what the labor movement actually wants to achieve through parliamentary politics, because strategic voting, I argue, sort of surrenders the labor movement's independent political vision as they enter into these electoral pacts, and in some ways suffocate themselves from criticizing the parties that they're encouraging their members to vote for, which can have a very debilitating effect on unions involved in parliamentary politics. So I'll end it there. Did you have anything else to say, Steph?
I want to just conclude by saying that, you know, there's a couple of other reasons that you should buy the book. One is that the people who are in the book, I think, really represent a new generation of scholars working in the field of work and labor studies on labor politics in Canada. Most of them are at the sort of the beginning and middle of their careers, and you know, we kind of explicitly brought those people together because we wanted to have you know, hopefully fresh voices on these issues. Not to say that we think our forebears are stale, but that we want to be part of that conversation. So that's one of the things that we really tried to do in that book. And
forebears are stale.
But the second thing too is that we have signed all of the royalties over to the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly. So for forever, as long as the book is in print, any royalties that are ensuing from the sale of the book will go to the Workers' Assembly, because you know, we have jobs, so we're okay. But I think too, like, it also does represent, in some ways, even though, you know, like all new organization building is fraught and difficult, but the Workers' Assembly does represent in its goals, in its vision, that attempt to build the kinds of working class organizations that we need in this new era. And so, you know, in terms of the commitments of the book and what we're trying to put on the table, is reflected in our decision to sign royalties over to the Assembly. And so, buy early, buy often.